Part two, we're going to be looking at the technologies that I was exposed to in Project Pegasus. And they were both technologies and methodologies. So if I could have the next slide, please. The first time travel technology that I include is remote viewing. Remote viewing is, in fact, a time travel methodology because it causes the human mind to go somewhere else in time-space. Even if it's just spatial, you're still making a transition to another location outside your immediate environment. The children of Project Pegasus, I like to say, were small mediums at large. We began remote viewing upon our entry into the program in 1969. And one of the targets that the project had me remotely view was the location of Lieutenant John McCain and whether or not he was in the Hanoi Hilton, the POW compound in North Vietnam, where in fact he was being held. We were brought together as a group of 8 children, 4 of the more psychically gifted kids from 2 elementary schools, essentially my school, Mount View Road School, and a neighboring school known as Cedar Knolls Elementary School. And we were meeting in an office at the school where faculty would convene around a table. And we were shown a large blow-up of John McCain's Annapolis graduation photograph when he was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy, which is the standard course where the Annapolis graduates then go on to commissions in the Navy. It was about a 24 by 36 inch blow-up of the picture that's now featured of John McCain's life on his English Wikipedia site. And we weren't shown this photograph, we were in fact shown a drawing of one of the buildings here in the Hanoi Hilton from street view. And we were told that they knew we were very psychically gifted children, that our parents were informing the government and so forth, that frequently we would talk about a future event and then it would happen, or we'd tell them what would be on the front page of the New York Times that morning before it was delivered, that sort of thing. We would have dreams that would then come true. And we were told that between that meeting and the next Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, we should let our minds go while we were lucidly dreaming and answer 2 questions about where bad people were holding John somewhere in the world. We weren't told that he was a Navy aviator that had been shot down over Vietnam and was now a POW. They just said that bad people were holding John somewhere in the world, and we should let our minds go to and answer 2 questions. Is he in this building? And if so, where is he in the building? And in the intervening week, I had, 4 or 5 lucid dreams. I saw John McCain being frog marched through dark hallways, being suspended with his elbows behind him until he passed out. And I also saw him, I saw his captors shoving his head down and pushing him into a tiger cage on the wall of an earthen hallway that had been built under the concrete pediment of this obvious POW type encampment or prison. So the next Tuesday at 10 in the morning, I and one of the little girls from the neighboring school were literally leaping out of our chairs to tell the lieutenant commander from the Office of Naval Intelligence and the team leader, who was Jack Pruitt, if I'm not mistaken, what we had seen. We had seen him in this location, and it was in this sub-basement tiger cage that had been excavated into the side of an earthen hallway. I have not yet spoken with Senator McCain about what we saw. I don't even know if that's what was happening in his life, but I'm going to be approaching him and telling him that at the time that he was imprisoned in North Vietnam, while his father, John McCain Sr., was serving as the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet of the U.S. Navy, our government had not just adult psychics, but child psychics working on finding him, apparently to either bomb his location and prevent him from being compromised as the son of the commander of the Pacific Fleet, or to bomb the prison and rescue him from captivity. But that was one target that we did for the Office of Naval Intelligence as remote viewers. Another thing that we were doing was we were being physically spun. If you put somebody on a tabletop-like device in a sort of classic Da Vinci Vitruvian man kind of body position, but with their head at the center of the circle, and to have them look up at a spiral image on the ceiling while they're being spun clockwise 33 rotations per minute, you can train them to literally go out of body, and that's what they were doing. And when we were out of body, we would then go through astral realms, and then when we come back into our body, we would then be interviewed by one of the ladies from DARPA. And after one of these, I had gotten to kind of like, I went out of body and I went far above the school. I saw this sneaker on the roof that I later told the janitor about. He said, "How did you see that?" Because the whole school's on flat ground. And I said, "I went out of my body and I saw it." And but I went up into kind of an environment where I was moving forward very fast with striated objects below me going backward and things above me going forward. And I got to a certain physical limit of how far I could travel out of body, and it was like a machine that was generating reality. It was like being a bee inside of a film projector at a theater and flying into where the film was being shown past the light that generates the image on the theater screen. I just couldn't go any further, and I could also see that the environment of light that we were located in is being created by a device. And so I came back into my body, frustrated that I couldn't get beyond the reach of the hologram because a machine was generating it. I was debriefed by a woman by the name of Stephanie Bindis, who was like many of the local facilitators. She was a health instructor. She had been a registered nurse during World War II in Korea, and she was a local health instructor, but had that Army medical connection. There were Army Field Hospital cots in the learning lab at Mount View. And she took out a fresh pad and a freshly sharpened number 2 pencil and said, "Okay, Andy, what did you see this time?" And I explained that I reached this physical limit that was seemingly the device that seemed to be generating reality. And she said, "Oh yes, other people have reported that too. We believe that it's propagating the hologram that we find ourselves in, and we're calling it the Matrix." Now this was 1970, 29 years before the Wachowski brothers did the first of their trilogy entitled the Matrix trilogy of films. So here we have the use of the term Matrix in the defense technical community 3 decades before it's released to the public. But this is obviously a form of time travel that I would describe as astral time travel. The third device was the Montauk chair. And I want to ask, just before I start talking about the Montauk chair, is there anybody here who was in the Montauk chair? Turns out that our lovely organizer of this event, Hesper Natali, was also a Montauk chair participant, one of the Montauk girls. And so I just want to interview Hesper briefly. Hesper, I was in the Montauk chair when it was just a magnetic transducer in the early 70s. And when and in what circumstances did you encounter the Montauk chair?
I was in the Gifted and Talented Education Program at Scott Lane Elementary School in the early 80s. And we were placed in what they called the chair. They weren't calling it the Montauk chair.
Right. Right, and where is Scott Lane Elementary?
In Santa Clara, California.
Mm-hmm. So here's somebody growing up 10 years later being placed in the chair. And it was also called the chair when we were using it at Mount View Road School in Morris Plains, New Jersey. Tell us about the chair that you were taking your probes. Were they probes to the future?
Yes.
Okay, so when you were going forward, sort of both mentally and physically at the same time, because what the Montauk chair propagates is you just don't see a moment in your future, you actually live it. Is that what was happening with you? You were not just sort of going and seeing what you would be doing, but you were actively going there on some level?
That's correct. It wasn't as though I was watching myself. It was as though I was experiencing the future moment, whatever it was.
Right. And I just agreed with Janet Swerdlow, the wife of Stuart Swerdlow, the Montauk project participant, that I had been describing the Montauk chair as simply something that was boosting my consciousness as a human being forward in time. So I was sort of seeing a dreamlike rendering of my future. But then again, I had also described how I was in my actual shoes upon arriving. I was actually in my body living that future event, pre-experiencing a future event. And so on some level, it was also a physical time travel device because it literally sent you there with the same cognizance of being a human being in your clothes and shoes and everything in a room or whatever, just like you were living it. So your introduction to the Montauk chair was about 10, 12 years later. How had it been improved from the rudimentary chair that existed in the 70s? Can you describe the chair that you were placed in
Well,
by the 80s?
but I wasn't having anything put over my face as you described.
Mm-hmm.
When I've heard you talk about the chair before, we just sat there and were able to experience our own future. And as I asked you once, were they somehow able to push us forward to get to the point, that they were looking for?
Mm-hmm.
And you had said, yes, they called it psychic driving.
Right.
So I wasn't really aware as a child that that's what was going on. I was just sitting in the chair and having the experience. But it turns out that the woman that was working with me was driving. She was doing some of the psychic driving and coming around from behind me.
Yeah, Hesper, let me describe the rudimentary one, and then we can show how far the device went by 10 years later into the 80s, working with school kids. This is simply a dental chair off the internet. There is no Montauk chair description or drawing or anything on the internet except my own. But basically, it was a recumbent chair, and it had a photographic umbrella-like thing over the head of the kid sitting in the chair. There was a sort of like a Cadillac hubcap type thing on the back of the chair that my father said was a metal canister that was kind of hiding the solenoid. That the solenoid was firing with magnetic transduction through the solar plexus. Our third chakra is where we direct our location in time. It's like we think that it's a thought that urges myself to go there, right? But actually, when you make that step and pursue a certain direction, it's from that third chakra, which is, that scholar chakra, that emphatic chakra that says, no, this is important to me. Well, who is it? We don't say, this is important to me, or our crown chakra, or whatever. We say, this is important to me, right? We actually touch our solar plexus. So that was the one they knew was the actual locational chakra level, where you ordain your actual location, time, space, even if it's a matter of me deciding to walk out this door. It's emanating from here. So there was a solenoid, a magnetic transducer, behind the solar plexus, the third chakra. There was a CPU, a computer, processing unit below the chair, and then a kind of like a fishhook-like rocker arm, there was a bulb that came up and pointed towards our face. In the early days, when I was taking the chair to my future from Morris Plains School as a third grader, beginning in spring of 1970, which is what Dr. David Anderson announced on Coast to Coast AM in 2002. He mentioned how the Montauk chair went national and involved thousands of American school children in 1970. I literally fell off my chair in my office in Los Angeles in those years because I said, well, he's right. That's in fact when I started in the Montauk chair, and they weren't calling it the Montauk chair. It was just the chair. But so then with that kind of technical structure, they then had diodes on top of a cotton mask we would wear, and they'd have audio headphones in our ears. And to get us to dissociate and go out of body and move forward in time, they would play sort of this syncopated kind of mathematically consistent musical tone that sounded kind of like a PBX tone, kind of like boo 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 boo. And it would basically space you out and you pop out of your body, move across a plane feet first, and then we would slam into the future. Was that happening with you?
No, it was, now, again, I don't have all my memories from the GATE program, but it was really more simple. It was just a matter of having me sit down in the chair. The woman that was working with me set me up somehow, but not as you're describing. And that wasn't so involved.
So you were like sitting in the chair?
Sitting and going.
Sitting and going, you said?
Yeah.
Right, and that's what was happening by the 79-80 second episode I had with the chair, which was as an undergraduate, a freshman at UC San Diego. I was getting up automatically, like on Tuesdays and Thursday mornings, like at dawn, and walking from your college, UC San Diego, over to Warren College, UC San Diego, to like a psych lab where they had the basic Montauk chair apparatus, but it had been connected to a video component where my thoughts were being shown in a screen in front of me. And that's where I provided the U.S. government the knowledge of, quote unquote, the Clinton-Gore presidency. So you're encountering the Montauk chair in your elementary school years a couple years later, right? Like 1983, 84.
Right.
And in what other way was the chair augmented by then?
Well, they weren't putting a screen in front of me. Because of my age. I was 10. But the way they had it set up for us was, it was almost like a mini cube around, the two sides of me and behind me, and sitting in something kind of like a dentist chair. It was different. But so the woman working with me would come out from behind me. So I can just suspect that maybe that screen that you're talking about was actually something she was looking at behind me.
Right. So they went from
it wasn't in front of me.
Right. They went from prompting an astral projection to your future.
Right.
One that was nonetheless physical, to then in the early 70s, by 79, 80, when I had my second exposure to the Montauk chair, they're attaching not just diodes over my eyes and ears, but in fact electromagnetic conductions to my skull to externalize my inner picture on a screen in front of me.
Right.
So to give a kind of a sharper picture. But then as you encounter the Montauk chair a couple of years later, by 83, 84, as a 10-year-old in Santa Clara, California, you're getting a kind of a video console being fed, but it was one that they had decided to then mask and kind of show to like a docent that was over your shoulder.
Yeah.
So that she could see what you were seeing and guide you through the future.
I could only guess, yeah. Knowing
Yeah.
that you had a screen in front of you, I could only guess that
Yeah.
that's what she was doing behind me.
Right.
Driving and also seeing the screen.
Right. Now, when you were a gifted and talented student at Scott Lane Elementary School at age 10, you received a visit from a young man who had been told by the CIA to visit you at age 10 when he was 22 and finishing out his undergraduate studies at UCLA. And who was that?
That was you.
Yeah, so could you describe what happened in that episode?
From my perspective, I was in a classroom with a couple of younger children, and the woman who worked with me, who was not part of our staff or our faculty at the school, in fact, the people that started the GATE program were not part of our staff or our faculty. They came from off campus. Nobody really was told where they came from. And she just one day said, Hesper, there's some people outside. Why don't you go get their attention? And so I guess I went up to the window and did something that you remember, but I wasn't told specifically that somebody was coming to see me. I was just told there's somebody outside, there's some people outside, why don't you get their attention? And so I did, and that's what I remember about that.
Right, and did you have a psychic impression that followed that brief meeting that we had between the glass that was on the side of your door in your gifted and talented student classroom?
Yeah, I did. When I went out to recess and I turned and looked back between the classrooms, between the buildings where the people had been, I did get some of what I get, which is my intuitive ability, and I would rather just keep that to myself for right now.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
that piece
So
is
here we have,
personal.
yeah, what had happened was in Los Angeles, one of my Mars training officers, Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA, in my last year of school, this is the 1983-84 school year, I'm 22 years old, being September born. I meet with him in Chatsworth, California, where my family lived, and Courtney lived with his wife Linda, not far from us. He was my second Mars training officer after Ed Dames the previous summer, and hence I knew Courtney from the summer of 1981 forward. I had originally encountered him when he came in from the future, just bodily appeared on the grounds that I'll be showing you, the Cerrillos Cultural Center site in New Mexico, where both a chronovisor and a Stargate device were when I was on Project Pegasus. But Courtney basically convened a meeting with me in Chatsworth, and he gave me Hesper's name, and I questioned, is it Hesper Natalie, or does this mean Natalie Hesper? Or, is there a comma here, as everybody comments?
All my life, yeah.
And he said, I want you to go up to Santa Clara and meet with this young lady. And I was thinking that it was a same-aged peer. And I looked at the paper and I said, Scott Lane Elementary School, you're having me meet with some girl in elementary school? And he said, yeah. And I said, well, what grade is she in? And he said, the 5th grade. And, I'm 22 and going to UCLA. It's kind of an odd request. Adults usually don't facilitate a meeting between a college boy and a young girl. It just isn't done. And I said, why are you having me go up there? And he said, because you two have a connection. And he wouldn't reveal to me what it was. I fly up there on CIA money. Basically, they bought the ticket for me. I went over to I think I flew out of Burbank, and they actually had the ticket waiting for me. So I then fly up, I take a rental car, and I still remember the Scott Lane Elementary sign. I've actually verified that on the internet. And I go into the office there, and I'm there for like a half hour, and I finally say, could somebody help me here? I mean, I've been here for a half hour. Somebody down in LA working for CIA wanted me to fly up here and meet with one of your students. So the secretary there, maybe a sort of older, maybe a high school student working there, says, oh, I'll get Mrs. So-and-so, who was apparently the director of the GATE program, the Gifted and Talented program that Hesper was enrolled in. We walked out of the school across the blacktop. All those California elementary schools had the blacktop all over the place. And I remembered that we had walked across a flag of the United States that was painted on the blacktop with each of the capital cities indicated. And we went over to the glass on the side of the door of Hesper's classroom, and she looked in and said, there she is. And Hesper got up and kind of, I don't want to embarrass you, but kind of flung her arms up like a baton twirler, like because she could tell we were looking in at her, and came up to the glass and slapped it in front of my face. And I kind of like phase shifted into like a shocked condition a little bit. And I still didn't know. So I turned to her and I said, why has the CIA sent me to come up here and view this 5th grade girl? And she said, we can't tell you, but there she is. And so Hesper can essentially corroborate the fact that people in CIA knew that we were connected in the future, and hence essentially corroborates my time travel account. If that wasn't the case, then it would have been an arbitrary introduction of us, for whatever reason, that then manifest years later of Hesper and I meeting each other. So it's either one or the other, but the bottom line is that we both recall this odd encounter when I was 22 and she was 10. And I believe its roots were in the fact that when I was in the Montauk chair at an even younger age, like age 9 in 1970, that I gave them Hesper's name as somebody I would know in the future, just like I gave the names of other people who I would either know personally or, like when I was in the Montauk chair at UC San Diego, I came up with Clinton and Gore as a president and as vice president in the future. I was even asked when, and I said the 2 terms before the turn of the century. They said, so 1993 to 2001? And I said, yeah. And I said, they're young Democrats, they're going to be very popular and very successful. And look at what Bill Clinton bragged about at the 2000 convention, where he reviewed all of his accomplishments as president. He had basically the only financially successful presidency of the 20th century, and he did incredible things. He was the president who dedicated the most acreage to national parks and forests and monuments after Theodore Roosevelt, and a bunch of other successes that he bragged about at the 2000 DNC. So we just wanted to, Hesper and I discussed talking about this here, because how did they know that we would meet in the future? Why would they have thrown us together at such odd ages if, in fact, I had not time traveled through some of the methodologies that I've been describing? So Hesper is one of a growing group of people who are corroborating different aspects of my background that show that the government was in possession of things like who I would know in the future. Ordinarily, you can't say to a 22-year-old, you're going to meet this person, this 10-year-old, 30 years later when she's 40 or in her late 30s. It's impossible without quantum access. We also have other theories possibly of what Hunt was doing. Hunt may have taken Hesper's name from my Montauk chair writings, my file that pertained to traveling to the future in the Montauk chair as a child, and then decided to have me meet her as a child, because then when we met in real time, that would basically prove my involvement in the program. So it may have been actually something basically positively surreptitious that Hunt was doing to undermine the secrecy of the project. But nonetheless, we not only have one of the Montauk girls here, but we have somebody from my past who knows I'm telling the truth, because the CIA had me go and meet her, what was it, Hesper, 27 years before we met?
Yeah.
Real time?
Yeah.
Something like that. I mean, it's impossible without quantum access. So they were keeping close files on what we were saying when we came back from those Montauk chair rides. I mentioned the teleporter, found in, and this is just sort of like the bluish-white Vortal tunnel that was created. It was more like, it was like going through a tunnel in time-space rather than the opposite form of teleportation, which is quantum teleportation, where you are disintegrated at the point of embarkation and then reintegrated cellularly at the destination, as featured in Star Trek, which would debut on American television in 1966. The problem with quantum teleportation, which is still being featured in the science press, is that it would kill a living organism. So DARPA developed the opposite methodology of propagating a tunnel in time-space through which we passed uninjured, rather than us having us basically be reduced to a hologram and sort of disintegrated like on Star Trek and then reassembled at the destination. That will never be available to the human race for the movement of people or animals in time-space, because doing that kills a living organism. Now, chronovisor. The first chronovisor I saw was at a National Security Watch Post in Flemington, New Jersey. And the technician was showing us through something that was being shown in an 8-inch circular screen. And he took myself and David, one of the other young boys in the program, over to the screen. And he said, "Look at this, boys." And I said, "Oh, it must be an historical reenactment of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in what's July 4th, 1776 in Philadelphia, in Independence Hall." And he said, "Nope, it can't be that, because who's this?" And I saw a very thin man, basically, not that tall, and I couldn't tell it was George Washington. I said, "Is that Washington?" He goes, "Yeah." And he goes, "Who's this?" And I was seeing the scene from, let's say, if a camera had been put in one of these windows. And yet, in fact, what I was seeing was that Benjamin Franklin was over on this side, sitting on a sofa, which he was. And I noticed that his head was about twice as large as any other man's in the room. Benjamin Franklin was a tall, fit man with the head of an elephant. He had this big, brilliant dome of a head. He was unusual looking, unusually large in every aspect. And I think that the average height of that era was like 5'8". I mean, James Madison was 5'6". Washington was only like 6 feet or 6'1", for being, the pillar of his time that he was. But he said, "Well, this is Franklin. We know that Franklin was at both of those events, but if this is George Washington, what event is this?" And I said, "Oh, it must be a public television broadcast from Philadelphia of the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17th of 1787. And he was kind of starting to say no when we were then called by our teacher to leave the facility, that our field trip to this remote viewing, or whatever you want to call it, chronovision post. My dad later explained that it was a National Security Watch Post. And what the guys were doing was basically, they had these big machines and they were filming on 16 millimeter film stock again, different arbitrary times that they were generating holograms with or of. And then they were putting them in canisters and putting the canisters in envelopes and pulling out a bug slip and then putting the bug slip back in the transparent pouch on the side of the envelope. They would put like Paris, 1920s, building of the Boulder Dam, Holland, 1800s, and just sort of describing what they had filmed remotely via chronovision. So as this guy was going to let the second shoe drop, we're called away, and he swivels his chair towards us and says, "Boys, that's not an historical reenactment of the signing of the U.S. Constitution. That is the signing of the U.S. Constitution." So this is fall of 1970. We then, in fall of 70, after we had been teleporting back and forth to New Mexico in summer of 70, we're now introduced to chronovision in fall of 70. And we're introduced to the fact that they can call up historical events like this. And Then they began taking us to chronovisor arrays that were three-dimensional. They weren't TV-like screens. They were basically a stage with a crystal array in the ceiling that was generating a cubical form of light where a past event was going on. Those were at Convent Station, New Jersey, at Morristown, and then at Nutley, New Jersey. My first chronovisor trip in the hologram was to a Civil War battle from the chronovisor array at Convent Station, New Jersey. But then we were told two boys had come into the facility on their Stingray bicycles and saw the chronovisor when it was in use. And that represented a threat to operational security. So they moved the chronovisor array to a building that was undergoing historical renovation in downtown Morristown, New Jersey. I just was in Morristown a couple weeks ago unsuccessfully trying to find which of those walls the entryway to the chronovisor array was, because the team leader was just pushing on a brick and a door would open and we would go in. And from there I was sent to Arizona around 100 million BC and watched two dinosaurs with tall necks chomping on some grass. I was sent to the Netherlands in the early 1800s where a Dutch lady pulled me out of an irrigation ditch, and ultimately the whole town was in her sort of barn-like house in 3 rows of spectators while the village elder came up to me and said, whatever it is in Dutch, he was saying something like, English, Latin, kinda? You know, or he thought it was some boy who had floated across the English Channel from England. English, Latin? No? Okay. And I obviously didn't know any Dutch, but that went on until nightfall, until a portal was inserted into the hologram, and I ran towards it and then got back to the present. I was living in a tenement for 3 days and 2 nights, a filthy tenement in the Five Points neighborhood of New York City around 1905, and it was filthy, and the kids in my tenement were being fed onion soup at every meal. There was a mature male factory worker and 2 young males around 21 years old that were coming back from the factory utterly exhausted. The tenement was filthy. The people, after going to the bathroom, were eliminating their waste on like this chopping board, this shovel-like thing, into the center of the facility. I mean, the tenement literally had an open outhouse in the middle of it. So it was literally an execrable place to try to fall asleep or even stand being inside the building. And I was just impressed at how impoverished some people were in New York, even in the beginning of the 20th century. I was being protected by one kid and picked on by a bully who he was protecting me from. And I'd like to think that 8-year-old in 1905, Five Points neighborhood, was maybe like Louis Nizer when he was a kid or something, the famous trial lawyer. Because the kid just had a heart of gold and was protecting me from the local bully after I told them I was a time traveler from 1971. So when the chronovisor was evolving from the flat screen to the crystal array in the ceiling propagating a hologram, not just a 2-dimensional image, I was in the experiments where it went from 3rd dimensional chronovision to 4th, and then really powerful 4th dimensional chronovision, where they were now exploring the future with chronovision, and I'll show you what that probe was. The advanced chronovisor, which was not just a couple technicians in the room, but like 40 people, and not just a small crystal array like a chandelier in a modern church or synagogue, but literally this huge device with people running all over the control room, sent us to 2013 to view the Supreme Court building on the Mall in Washington, D.C. in 2013. And when I was debriefed later about what I saw during that, it was basically an hour probe. We were fastened to stanchions on the stage. We had these time-space suits that were sputter-coated with titanium and that had crystal helmets that we could both breathe through and talk through. We were sent for a half hour through wave after wave of this sort of pastel-colored gas or clouds. And then we were told that when we felt 3 pulses, we should look quickly to our left and right and try to see what was there. What was there was the Supreme Court building. And as I explained to my debriefer from the Office of Naval Intelligence down the hallway there, at ITT Defense Communications in Nutley, New Jersey, the Supreme Court by 2013 was under about 100 feet of brackish water. And I described how I could see algae growing on the columns of the Supreme Court building. And that hasn't happened yet. What is it? It's November 2nd of 2013. But I did have That jump occurred on November 5th of 71, and I had a glitch teleporting back from New Mexico to New Jersey that set me on a second timeline. So the fall 1971 memories like this one, right before that glitch, could actually be remnants of a timeline that I've left, because clearly we haven't seen a global coastal flooding event that would put the Supreme Court building under 100 feet of water. That would be massive flooding. But then again, NOVA has, public television, has reported that if the East Antarctic ice sheet melted, the Empire State Building would be flooded up to its 18th floor, basically 180 feet of flooding. So here I was actually looking at a lesser event where the Potomac had only flooded sort of 100 feet above the Supreme Court building, but very close to the same measure. I used this kind of pointilla style not to show what I was looking at. I was actually, it was almost as if I was diving on the Supreme Court building as a marine artifact, but that this is what the building itself looked at. It looked like a pointillist painting, where there were all these little bubbles that were making up the building. So in a sense, the Supreme Court building flooded was an event that was sort of forming in the future, sort of in the contemplation of God, so to speak, but had not yet happened. And that, again, was the first attempt to chronovise people to the future, and that's maybe why it was sort of an incomplete image. Sort of the idea of the event rather than the event itself. Then there were devices called Stargates. This is another area where films and television have been used to conceal technical terms from these defense projects. This is the gymnasium at the Cerrillos Cultural Center site, built by the Works Progress Administration under the first administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president during the Depression. And inside here was a Stargate device that was a black gate that went all the way up to the ceiling of an Olympic-sized gymnasium, Olympic-sized basketball court. And we would run up the ramp through this notch, neon-colored blue notch or doorway at the bottom of this huge black gate. And we would go forward through a vortal tunnel that was identical to the Tesla tunnel. This is the simple shop floor model, but it was 30 seconds rather than 3 seconds in the tunnel. And we were trained to inflate our lungs and kind of breathe off the top. Today I have kind of a bronchial asthma in the top of my lungs that they're having me inflate, so that may be a project injury. But at the time I didn't have any problem doing that because I'd been playing alto saxophone for a couple of years, and I could totally inflate my lungs and breathe from that air in my lungs, just survive by kind of taking sips out of my lungs of air. But I would appear somewhere in this industrial park in front of this beautiful tungsten steel and emerald building, go through the predominantly white house plant inundating first level, and they were giving us these small canisters with microfilm summaries of events occurring between the 1970s and the 2040s. So we're really being sent forward back in time to retrieve the history of the future for the U.S. Defense Department, which obviously included events like 9/11 and other national security incidents. And then we would go into a conference room back here in the building. And this building looks a lot like the building. It almost might have been inspired by it. Or it may be the building as it was ultimately built before 2045, which was the year they were sending us to. And then we would jump through the wall of a conference room and find ourselves back in a vortal tunnel, and we would reappear in the present on the grounds of the microwave tower array north of Pagosa Springs, Colorado, and due west of the Continental Divide side, the Continental Divide itself. I've gone up there a couple times to the area where we were being collected from the future. One thing that the public hasn't been told is that when these microwave towers out in the boonies are pinging microwave into the universe, one of the functions of that is to tell time travel personnel in the future where to put time travel personnel from the past back in time, because that's where we were jumping back to, was all the way up in Colorado. So we were going from Cerrillos to somewhere in the southwest and then coming back to southwest Colorado. So I'm not sure that all the data that was on the microwave was preserved, because of course we were coming back through a vortal tunnel in time-space under radiant energy, and it's possible that the microfilm then had to be processed and some or much of it was lost. But I know some of that footage was preserved. We were shown how much film was in the canister. It was like 600 feet. One time Jack Pruitt, just to relieve us of the curiosity of seeing the film, just took an arbitrary piece and just pulled like 600 feet out in front of us, or at his feet. And he said, and then he passed it around, and we could see it was all encrypted. It was all barcodes and numbers and symbols. It made absolutely no sense. So even if we had violated the secrecy requirement and looked at what was on the microfilm, we wouldn't have seen what it was communicating of the future. So I'm often asked, what was 2045 like? Well, for me, it was jumping through a big Stargate in Cerrillos, New Mexico in 1972, summer of 72, going through a vortal tunnel for about 30, 33 seconds, whatever, coming out somewhere on this vast pedestrian plaza. All I could see is people walking, taking bicycles, or riding the sedgeways. You know, Dean Kamen's It, from one building to another, for example. And then I would walk into the building, get a microfilm scroll, and then jump through the wall. I didn't see anything of 2045 beyond just doing that. It was just an errand. So if we could have the next. Then there was my encounter with the plasma confinement chamber. It was just a big lucite box, about maybe the size of half of a tennis court on its medial axis. And it was at the direction of Sterling Colgate. I reviewed Colgate briefly before this. My dad took me over to the time lab in East Hanover and he told me that they wanted to kind of give me a treat or a reward because I had done everything they had asked me to do ably and well, to the best of my ability. And my dad asked, with Sterling Colgate standing behind him, said, "So Andy, do you want to go to Gettysburg on the day Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address and see him give the address?" And all I could think of was that 1863 photograph of Lincoln by Alexander Gardner, where he's sort of standing forward. He sort of looks like a highly intelligent monkey in a black suit with a black bow tie. And I said, "No, Dad, I don't." I was actually, kind of like panicking because I really didn't want to stand at Abraham Lincoln's feet, thank you very much, when he gave the Gettysburg Address. That would be a little bit too much of a head rush. Previously, I had met Washington and briefed him, but every time the idea of something special in the program came up, I got these waves of panic. And so I said, "No, Dad, I'd rather not go and stand at Abraham Lincoln's feet while he gives the most famous address in the history of the country, thank you." And then Dr. Sterling Colgate says to my dad, "Well, Ray, let's reconvene in a couple of weeks and ask Andy that question again. I bet you dollars to donuts that he'll agree." And so we leave, we come back, I have all this trepidation of several weeks about, I'm going to be going back to the time lab in East Hanover. And by the way, I found that building in my recent trip to East Hanover, New Jersey. And I also walked the streets of Gettysburg and retraced my steps. And so I said, "Yeah, Dad, I'll go." And I was really saying so just to please my dad. So he says, "Excellent, son, so let me show you where you're going." And he took out a map of Gettysburg in 1863, or a little bit later. And he said, "There's a main south street through Gettysburg, I have several, called Washington Street. And we know there's a street to the northwest called Mummasburg Road, because it's still there. And what we're going to do is we're going to put you down here," and he put a little X over on the southern side of Mummasburg Road. "And we want you to start walking. And the first person you encounter, yell, 'Hey friend, which way Gettysburg?'" Apparently people of rural Pennsylvania used, the Quaker terminology of friend for a when addressing strangers. And so he then described how he was going to walk down Washington Street. He said, "Well, what does Mummasburg remind you of?" And I said, "Mama?" He goes, "Yeah, Mama." So Mama, if you have to ask somebody, is this Mummasburg Road? That's a good device to remember that. And then who was this street named after here, going straight south through the town of Gettysburg? And I said, "Well, Washington." He said, "Well, who was he?" "The father of our country, the first president, whatever." And he said, "Yeah, you're going to be walking through farmland, and then call out to whoever you see to get directions of whether you're walking in the right direction or not. If you are, just continue on that road and then go right the first chance you have and walk straight south. You'll walk straight south into Gettysburg. And there'll be more farmland, but then you'll see 3 blocks of urban streetscape that looks very much like contemporary Morristown, New Jersey, so you'll be familiar with what you're looking at. Then when you walk through those 3 blocks of settled townscape, the first left you can make is going to be a sharp left to the northeast on the northern end of Emmitsburg Road. Gettysburg is a it's a crossroads town, so that all the roads out of town are named for the town that they point to. Carlisle, Baltimore, Gettysburg, Emmitsburg. They're all town names that are in the streets. So this is the northern pike here of Emmitsburg Road between Washington and Baltimore streets. And there are shops there. So just when you get that far, that close to the cemetery where Lincoln's going to be giving the Gettysburg Address, make that left and just ask somebody there if they can go, you can go with them to the address. So if you're ready to go, son, Valerie can outfit you. We're going to dress you as a Union bugle boy. So I go into this dressing room with about 200 period clothes in it. So they must have been using plasma confinement to send people to all manner of places. And Valerie said, I want to just have you blend into the social environment, so I'm going to dress you as a Union bugle boy. So she outfitted me with a hat, this really neat dark blue jersey, and pantaloon pants, and these new black shiny shoes as a bugle boy. And then I came out and kind of went ta-da like that to my dad, because it's like buying a new suit at Robert Hall's or something, right? And so he then explained how the plasma confinement chamber works, which is that they would emit plasma under confinement in one side of that lucite chamber, and when I walk past the line on the floor, like a tennis court line, into that plasma, that radioactive plasma, I would sense the floor dropping out below me, and I would wormhole for about 30 seconds, and they would put me down there on the southern side of the sort of the northwest corner of the overall town of Gettysburg, and then I would walk into town. Well, I've retraced those steps during my recent trip to Gettysburg a couple weeks ago, and one thing I found that two of the buildings, one of the buildings dated from 1776, on the commercial district there on Emmitsburg Road, where John Lawrence Burns ended up giving me shoes and a jacket. The shoes that are visible in this image right here, these grossly oversized men's street shoes and this Union winter parka, were given to me by a downtown Gettysburg cobbler when I went. But recently when I went there, I walked the area where the shops were, where John Burns used a key to go into a men's clothing store and give me the jacket and shoes. And I asked three of the proprietors that are working there now, that they have shops there now, was your shop here when Lincoln was here on November 19th of 1863? And they said, all three of them said yes. I also did some research and found that the Dobbin House, right near the turn from Washington Street onto Emmitsburg, was built sometime between 1776 and 1849, and that the O'Rourke Tavern across the street was built in 1829. So I had 5 commercial establishments of record there. But then when I went to the Adams County Historical Society and the Gettysburg Historical Society, they're relying on a map from 1872 that doesn't show any commercial establishments on that street. And all of the official historians and experts denied that that street had any shops the day I was there. But I said, no, in fact, the day Lincoln was there, there were shops all the way up that northern side of the street. So I went back, in other words, in real time, recently, and proved what was there when I was there in 1863, the day Lincoln was there, and details of Gettysburg that are not in the official history, because the official historians don't believe there were any shops there because their sources don't show those shops. Okay, so Mr. Burns helped me. Actually, I've now got the orientation of where everything was. My father had said Lincoln's going to be arriving on the dais here when he arrives from the Wills Hotel with David Wills. I had thought, therefore, that the Wills Hotel was in this direction, which would be basically west. This is a northern view with Lincoln giving the Gettysburg Address on the front of a northern-looking dais, with him looking true north on the northern perimeter of the Evergreen Cemetery, with this being the later grounds of the military cemetery. And that big U.S. military cemetery in Gettysburg is about a mile south of Evergreen Cemetery. So Lincoln, over my right shoulder here, gave the Gettysburg Address in their traditional civilian cemetery. And I followed John Lawrence Burns down Emmitsburg towards Evergreen's Cemetery, and then onto the grounds on another diagonal, and then down this way, and then we entered through like a gate on this side there's like an archway there that's still there. And it's in the other picture of Lincoln at Gettysburg, which is the John Richter photograph. This is the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. It was probably taken by Matthew Brady, but Lincoln was found in it by Josephine Cobb when the photograph was donated to the Library of Congress in 1951. And here we find it in the Life magazine archives. So we came in through the gate, there were some trees. There were two ladies in their Sunday best who were noticing me, and it looked obviously like a carpetbagger with both military and civilian clothing on. I then came around to the front of the dais and encountered my father dressed as a Pennsylvania farmer, but looking several years at least younger than he did back at the time lab in East Hanover. And so I turned to him and said, "Dad, what are you doing here? I didn't know you were going to be here when I got here." And he just remained silent. I said, "Dad, it's your son. You're not, and we're in 1863 from 1972, and you're not going to even address me?" My dad stepped away, and as is consistent with his training to preserve the operational security of what we're doing, he stepped away and said, "I'm not your paw boy," like in a rural Pennsylvania accent. Of course, he was from Summit Hill, so he knew how to fake that, right? Like Pennsylvania farmers dressed in bib overalls. So my dad maintained operational security and didn't address me, and that really spooked me. Then because of that, I walked around him over to the left side of the dais again, where I was questioned intently by two Union officers about what my regiment was, where it was bivouacked, and I didn't have answers to those questions. And then one of the officers leaned towards me while he's chomping on an apple with his paring knife and said, "Boy, are you a little bit touched in the head, son? Have you seen a little bit too much of the fight?" And I said, "Yes, sir," because I knew that he would stop questioning me and I wouldn't be jailed. Now, I then intentionally walked from where Lincoln would soon be speaking, or at least we thought he would be speaking. In fact, he wouldn't speak for 3 hours, so they had actually sent me to Gettysburg too early in the morning, because it was at this location, very shortly after Lincoln, that the cheer had gone up, and I realized that Lincoln had stepped on top of the dais. He actually took a horseback ride from the Wills Hotel out here to the north, and come down Baltimore Street, and then down Emmitsburg, and as my dad had said, he arrived on the dais here, but he dismounted his horse there. He'd come down in a procession with 9 other riders and like 100 distinguished citizens. So here we are in 2013. How many Americans know that Lincoln took a horse to the Gettysburg Address, right? They also don't know that in what was often identified, or until recently identified, as the sole surviving photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg, there was a 10-and-a-half-year-old me standing prominently in this particular photograph, because I walked over from the dais, put my back to the dais, and then looked in the opposite direction from where my father told me that Lincoln would soon be arriving with David Wills. And I looked to my left, and I saw a man who must have been Matthew Brady setting up his camera on a small stepladder over here. And then he looked over at me and went back under his photographer's canopy. And then I saw a flash as my whole body was experiencing sort of this Kundalini sensation, as my father had described. He said, when the effect wears off, you won't wormhole back like you'll wormhole there. You'll just feel sort of like this super excitation, and you'll suddenly be back in the plasma confinement chamber here in East Hanover. So that's what happened. I mean, right as I was starting to feel like I was going back to the future, which is a term that they may have literally borrowed from me for the feature film, I'm not sure. I saw Brady going back under his canopy, and I sensed the picture was taken. Okay, now, here's one of the 3 quantum synchronicities of this photograph. Besides it being not only, which until recently was the sole surviving photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg, but is literally the first photograph to dispositively show a time traveler from the future, namely myself. There are 3 quantum synchronicities about this photograph that are actually truly bizarre. Actually 4, but let me go through those. One is that you can see I'm holding a cylinder here. What it was a scrolled up piece of paper that had a letter to Gideon Welles, who was the Secretary of the Navy for Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, to explaining who I was and to offer me aid and assistance in the event I needed it when I was in the field, whether I was injured and whether I was distressed or detained in the field. I should be taken to Secretary Welles to be given his aid and assistance. Well, because I faded back from view while I was still holding that and hence didn't have to be protected by Gideon Welles in any way, I actually faded and went back to the future. I didn't use that instructions to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles. But in 2011, when I was in distress in the field on the island of Maui, somebody who had friended me on Facebook 2 days before I asked her assistance, my friend Janet Lesson, helped me and gave me aid and assistance in 2011 on the island of Maui, and she is a direct lineal descendant of Navy Secretary Gideon Wells. That's the first quantum synchronicity. The second quantum synchronicity that's as bizarre, so here I finally get the help from the Wells family, but it's in 2011, not in 1863. The second bizarre coincidence is that the photo analyst at the Library of Congress, Josephine Cobb, who found Lincoln in this Matthew Brady photograph on the dais as he was sitting down, I believe, is the great aunt of William Brett Stillings, who you'll be introduced to tomorrow, who was one of my fellow Mars jumpers. I mean, his mother's name is Gail Cobb Stillings. Mr. Stillings married a Cobb. So Brett is literally related. He's the great nephew of the woman at the Library of Congress who found Lincoln in this doubly famous photograph, because now that everybody's known that Lincoln's in this, they're now learning that I'm in it from 1972. The third synchronicity is that my best friend from college, Chris Baker, is a cousin of the Gettysburg family that sold their farm to the Eisenhowers when President Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower retired in Gettysburg after he left the presidency. And I'm personal friends with their great-granddaughter, Laura Magdalene Eisenhower. When I went back to Gettysburg recently, I realized something extraordinary, which was that not only was Gettysburg celebrating the sesquicentennial of the battle there and of the Gettysburg Address there, but I was celebrating my sesquicentennial having gone there in 1972. What is that? 40 years in my past, but ultimately 150 years, because in 1972, from the present date of 2013, during the sesquicentennial, I went back to a town in America 150 years after I had been there. So I think that's the longest time that somebody's gone to a place via time travel and then gone back there in real time. But I went back in real time 150 years after the original visit. So now there are some recent findings about the Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg. People have asked, well, in the plasma confinement process, did you take the oversized shoes and the jacket back and the cap and the letter to Gideon Wells? And the answer is yes, there was a plasma effect around me. So this stuff came back. Now, with a plasma effect being around a time traveler from the future, isn't it curious that there's this gray ET standing here with his arms out, like touching me? Here's his head, his shoulders, and his two arms are like literally pointing to me. Definitely a nonlinear aspect of this photograph that's in the original photograph. Trying to think, the other thing that's been found recently is blow-ups of my face show through my cheek, my whole left teeth, both top and bottom of my left teeth. Now that's something that we can achieve via X-ray. You could put an X-ray unit up against somebody's cheek and show their whole dentition on the left side of their head, right? The problem is that the discoverer of radium, Marie Curie, would not be born until 1867, okay? We didn't have X-ray back then. There's no way that Matthew Brady, setting up, a Hasselblad camera of that era, could have created some kind of radiation effect or X-ray effect where my teeth would be visible through my left cheek. So the image of me itself shows what we've now found, it shows what I reported, which is that it was as I was fading from view that the man, namely Matthew Brady, took the photograph. So I think we're going to discover more in this photograph. But everybody's commented how, first of all, how well-fed I look. I had a chubby face then, as I do now. And look at how skinny, for example, this adult male is. This is obviously one of the citizens of Gettysburg. Their crops have been destroyed back in July of 1863 when the Battle of Gettysburg swept through and passed their town. Look at how skinny this guy was as a result of privation of food during the war. But I look pretty well fed. I look like a kid from New Jersey from 1972. And also the casual way I'm standing is sort of like that, that kind of that 1970s kind of casual thing. Somebody would be standing in their wallabies, So this is, in fact, me, and I will go to my last day sticking to that position because that's what happened. I ended up getting photographed, but I didn't see Lincoln. I later asked my dad back at the house. I heard him, the cry that went up, but I didn't see him give any part of the address. And in fact, I faded from view before I could have seen him even start several hours later. Back then, in 1972, I asked my dad what it was like to see the Gettysburg Address. And he said it was just a man with a beard standing there on the stage giving a speech. And I said, well, don't you remember anything special about it? He said, in fact, I do. He said that Lincoln's voice was very, very rural and high-pitched. And I said, oh, well, what did it sound like, Dad? And he said it sounded like this. He said, Lincoln sounded like, he was speaking like this. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth to this continent a new nation. So it was like my dad said it was very rural. And of course, Lincoln was a rustic born in Hodgenville, Kentucky, right? And had practiced law almost his whole career in Illinois on the prairie, the edge of American civilization in the Midwest at that time. And we now know, and this is literally a discovery made after my dad had imitated Lincoln's voice, that Lincoln had a disease of the connective tissue, which affects sometimes the vocal cords, called Marfan syndrome. And we've had, in fact, there were several professional athletes who died of it because it also affects the performance of the heart. And so how was it that my dad, just looking at Lincoln, if this was not a true story, would have been able to say that his vocalization was very stretched out, very high-pitched as a result of having some kind of something affecting his vocal cords? In fact, we now know it was Marfan syndrome. And that's really all that he could say. He said, he wasn't particularly frightening to watch. I mean, I knew it was Lincoln, but he was just a man with a beard. And then I said, Dad, can you send me back so I can see Lincoln give the Gettysburg Address? And he said, no. And I said, why not? And he said, if we send you back, there'll be 2 of you there, and that'll be a threat to operational security. So that, again, that's the duplication factor when you have multiple returns to the same, or forward displacements to the same place in time-space. So how was it that I looked older to my dad, and my dad looked younger to me? Well, that's easy. We had been sent at different times to the same day. So he had gone, let's say, in 1967, 68, when we first started teleporting. And he said, when I saw you there over on my right, you were addressing me as your dad, that's how I learned you would be in the program. So that Andy that he knew that morning, when he was sent originally, I was like a 4-year-old back at the house. And here he's seeing, or 6-year-old or something, and here he is seeing me at 10 and a half, but on the same day that he was sent there. So to me, he looked like he did in the mid-60s with his crew cut rather than his straight haircut. So that can also be something that can be used for intelligence gathering, where you have 2 people from different times literally meet each other on a common day in time-space. And that's what happened to my dad and I. There was a displacement in our relative ages in both directions, because he had jumped earlier and then I jumped, but I jumped to the same day he was there. Okay, the jump room was just in development, the one that we would take to Mars by 1976, according to Michael C. Ralph, one of my fellow jumpers. It was just about emerging. Ultimately, it was merging on Project Pegasus when I was a kid. They had like small jump rooms they were jumping documents from Washington, D.C. to the atomic labs in New Mexico, because obviously it was instantaneous and we didn't have fax machines. But ultimately, I would be jumping from a jump room that was a dual use of the elevator inside this Hughes aircraft building in El Segundo, California. And that's just kind of a description of the fact that the elevator inside would morph from a box into a cylinder. We'd have to right ourselves with our hand as if we're walking through a water main between Earth and Mars. So I have to throw that in there as the 8th form of time travel that I would encounter, but 10 years later, not when I was serving in Project Pegasus. Okay, why use children? Part 3. First, we were experimentees. They thought they might introduce Tesla teleportation to move the president, the vice president, and their families, and so forth, other executive branch officials, ambassadors, military personnel, members of the cabinet, their families, in an urgent way between U.S. military bases. So we were clearly being experimented on as children from stable, prosperous family backgrounds, not children who had experienced privation as the kids from Latin America had, because they wanted to test the physical and mental effects of Tesla teleportation on children who are around the age that children tend to be when their dad's president. Look at the Obama girls. They were about, when he came into office in 2008, I think the younger girl was about the age I was when I first teleported. And who knows, maybe they've been teleported already. But they wanted to have us jump to New Mexico, and then we took part in a battery of SAT-type mental tests and were medically examined for heartbeat, blood pressure, and so forth, heart rhythms, any presence of heart arrhythmias, and so forth. at an old school site in Lamy, New Mexico. So we were experimentees. I don't like to use the term guinea pigs because we were actively not just time traveling, but gathering intelligence for the U.S. government. So we were not guinea pigs. We were just giving them a baseline understanding of what would happen. We were also necessities because they found when they were working with adults in the chronovisors, when the chronovisors became holographic arrays, that the size, the heartbeat, the respiration, a sneeze or a cough, the footfall of an adult would cause the hologram to go on the blink or fritz, as an early television set would. Basically, the hologram would start quaking like gelatin and then just pop out, even if, let's say, an adult asked the technician something. So they could either use diminutive people with different growth disorders, or they could train a cadre of gifted and talented American school children, such as myself, and they decided to do the latter because they decided to convert us into viewees, namely kids whose perceptions would be so keen that we would be, because we were tabula rasa, as they explained, we would be able to give them more accurate intelligence when we were time traveling. And they also decided to use gifted and talented kids because we were trainees. We were time-space cadets who, as Rumsfeld had explained back in the bar in Albuquerque, would be run through the Naval Academy after high school and involved as a pretext for involving us in future time travel activities. Okay, part 4, the findings. I'll go through these rather quickly. They knew about Nixon's resignation. In 1973, when I was in Albuquerque, in New Mexico, having jumped there from the fall of 1971 with my father, I walked behind 2 guys who'd been identified as CIA guys, and one of them said to the other, "So it looks like what happens is that Nixon gets ensnared in a scandal called Watergate and resigns the presidency." And the other guy just slid onto the bar and just went, "Oh, Christ," and collapsed. Because these were Nixon Republicans in the project, and there were a lot of Nixon Republicans in the CIA. What I learned from Bernard Mendez, my fellow jumper, who was for years essentially the Indiana Jones of the U.S. time-space program. He has saved hundreds of people in trouble in the field, both in time-space and just in space, just in the jungles of Costa Rica and on Mars. Bernie claims that Richard Nixon was set up to leave the office under Watergate because people had been exploiting the time travel technology to create billion-dollar fortunes. And when Nixon learned of that, he tried to prevent it. And the Watergate scandal was propagated underneath him to pull the rug out from underneath him. So when you talk about Nixon here being the president when Project Pegasus was launched, he may have lost his presidency in 1974 by trying to police the very time travel activities that his administration had initiated. Kind of ironic, to say the least. I also know that they knew about AIDS, not necessarily in terms of the name of it, but in terms of the notion of an epidemic disease that at least partially could be a venereal disease in its transmission, because they were watching the personal conduct of people, and what they actually thought they had found is a rise in autoerotic sexual activity as distinguished from companion sexual activity. And Connie Chavez was looking at the same scene, and she said, well, didn't they say there's some disease that emerges where you can have sex and you can die? So she had remembered another previous talk about AIDS. So they knew about AIDS, at least the phenomenon, if not the HIV/AIDS, terminology. Another thing that my dad revealed before his death in '90, I was asking him for more things they knew about the future. Oh, okay, the advent of the internet. Was that the...
That was the next one.
Okay, yeah. Okay. I know they knew about the advent of the internet because one day at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque, John Alexander McCone, who everybody was calling Alec, was trying to explain to my dad what the internet was. So they're sitting across from each other, and I'm kind of wandering around like kids do, around the picnic table in that restaurant, and or a long table in that restaurant. And John McCone looks over at my father and says, "Ray, what the internet is a global system of communication. It's really the fulfillment of Vannevar Bush's primary fundamental. I mean, we see people consulting it every morning. It's the primary device in their house or at work. And what it is, it's this global communication system where a person sits in front of a VDT, obviously they're engineering types, so they have to call a television screen a VDT, right? A video display terminal. And they're sitting and typing on a keyboard that's very much like the ones that are emerging now in our electronic typewriters. And through that system, they can communicate in TypeScript with anybody else on the planet who's on this system of global communication. And my dad said, well, what about these suffixes? He goes, what do you mean, Ray? My dad goes, well, what about .com, .edu, .info? And McCone said, those are just destinations on the global communication system, Ray. .com means communications. .edu is clearly an academic institution that they're communicating with. My dad stands up and pulls his leg over the bench there at this picnic table-like bench in the restaurant, and says, I don't know about this .com thing. And John McCone gets kind of vociferous and says, it's just telling the person on the system that it's a communications type of communication, right? And my dad turns around and says, how do we know that? Maybe it means the commies have taken over by then. So that's my favorite anecdote, because it really shows that these scientists and engineers did not have a full grasp of what the future held. In fact, it became the rise of the dot-commies, not the commies, when the internet ultimately emerged. More towards his, well, not during the project days, but towards his death in 1990, I had a conversation with everything they had learned about the future. And my dad said, well, we definitely found out that there was going to be widespread use of mobile phones. And I said, why? And he said, well, every time we propagated like a street scene, Denver, Colorado, 2005, Chicago, Illinois, 2020, we all saw all you people who are going to go on and survive into those years, walking around with these little walkie-talkies. So again, even 20 years after the project, my dad didn't have a full grasp of our present. But that was another thing they couldn't help but see, because cellular phones are so ubiquitous that he was describing how they would just look at any scene, like a hotel suite, and a hotel in New York City in 2015, and people were walking all over the street with their cell phones. They also clearly knew about 9/11. My dad was using the La Hacienda restaurant and the sort of unofficial government services of Connie Chavez as a kind of an organizational exchange post for his involvement in Project Pegasus, a collection area, if you will. One day we had just completed lunch there at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque. One of the men working there, Wentworth Brown, who I actually connected with and got a photograph of him. Wentworth called over my dad and said, Ray, we got a telephone call for you. Yeah, at your phone, right, near the door. And we went over there. My dad picked up the phone call and just listened intently, and then thrust the phone down rather briskly and said, come on, son, get in the car, or follow me to the car. So we followed him to his rental car there in New Mexico. And he gets down to Socorro, New Mexico in about an hour, which means it's 90 miles south of Albuquerque. So he must have been driving like at 80, 85, 90 miles per hour. We go into the Aerojet Corporation facility that used to be there. It was a C-shaped building with a zero-scaped front yard. New Mexico Tech was right behind it. And we'd go through the center, and we'd be cleared through a security desk there with a man with a badge and a gun. And my dad showed his Department of Defense credentials and said, my son's coming with me. These prison bar-like bars rise up, allowing us access to the left side of the sea. And this technician approaches my dad in the hallway, extremely excited, saying, we've got it, Ray. We've got scenes of the domestic Pearl Harbor. Check this out. So we go down. We go into a room with about 20 monitors, and the two young technicians there, who must have been like graduate physics students under Sterling Colgate at New Mexico Tech, are playing a video, and it was a Betamax video. They put a Betamax tape in, which means that the U.S. government had Beta like 10 years before it was introduced. And what we saw was about a 20-second film loop of one of the planes hitting one of the Twin Towers in Manhattan on the day it happened 30 years in the future, the day it would happen 30 years in the future. After seeing that, my dad was frequently being quizzed at lunch by people who didn't have as high a security clearance, like, what is this 911 thing, Ray, this 9/11? We understand it's some kind of domestic Pearl Harbor. Do you know what really happens that day? And at one of those lunches, my dad said, yeah, we know that Middle Eastern hijackers hijack commercial airliners and slam them into the Twin Towers that are now being built in New York City and the Pentagon. And then one of the guys says, well, then what happens? And he goes, well, sadly, the World Trade Center sustains a fatal hit, a base hit, and they collapse. And one of the guys was just, utterly despondent. He goes, "Oh, that's horrible! Right there in Manhattan, those buildings that high just come falling down." And my dad goes, "Yep, like a ton of bricks." And then they wait a little while and they say, "Well, what happens after that, Ray?" And he said, "The country picks itself up, dusts itself off, and goes on again like nothing happened." Now that was my dad's perspective for some reason. He left out the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. But he was giving the conventional Time magazine version of the event, and why would that be? Because probably we were watching just images. There was no way of knowing who had committed the airplane strike on one of the Twin Towers. But in the microfilm summaries of future events, it would have been the conventional, kind of version of the event that they would disseminate in school books, that they would put in Time magazine end of the year review type articles and so forth. So my dad had the conventional story. That's not to say that I don't believe it might have been an inside job. I'm just saying that the story that was being disseminated by Project Pegasus to itself from the future, in addition to the footage of the event, was the conventional account. And that's the one that my dad would then explain to his colleagues. Another thing, they said, "Well, what do they build?" 5 minutes later, one of the guys, these guys being engineers and architects and so forth and physicists, say, "Well, what do they build where the towers come down, Ray?" From another table. And he goes, "They build like a monument that's a big spire like this." And he actually made the shape of Freedom Tower. So that's the grasp they had of public events in the early 70s, was not just 9/11, but its literal aftermath when they rebuilt that site in downtown Manhattan. They also had, and this is a very important thing, they had a notion or a belief on the program that they shouldn't play God and act in the present to change future events as a result of detecting them, but they did, on the margin in one particular area, was they did identify future presidents, and here's how I know that. I know they had identified President Jimmy Carter as a future U.S. president because Alfred Lambermont Weber's book, Exopolitics, was taken by my father out of a black leather pouch at lunch with Connie Chavez and myself. And I actually heard Connie ask my dad, who is Alfred Lambermont Weber? She also asked, who is Jimmy Carter? Because at the front of that book, Alfred put a passage from Jimmy Carter associated with the sending of that spacecraft out into space with the image of the man and the woman and the chart to find our location space and all that, our DNA. And my dad said something like he's presently he either said governor or lieutenant governor of Georgia, and he becomes president. So we know that DARPA, the CIA, knew about the Carter presidency about at least 5 years before it happened. I know more directly that the presidency of George H.W. Bush was known because I was invited to a lunch, kind of a late lunch, a 4 o'clock lunch or early dinner at the La Hacienda restaurant when both George H.W. Bush and his young son, then in his mid-20s, George W. Bush, were present as guests. And so if you could advance a couple forward to grab it, George W. Bush. The reason that I know I met them is because they were introduced to me. In fact, Barbara Bush, the wife of the first Bush president and the mother of the second, George W. Bush, was also there. And George W. Bush was going to every table where there were project people and announcing what he and his father had just learned. He was saying, "Have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president." Sorry, I'm a little bit out of breath. But let me try that again. Where George W. Bush was going around to all the tables saying, "Hey, have you heard? My daddy and I are going to be president." That was what I was going for there. Anyway, so he and his father clearly had just been apprised of their mutual presidencies, and he was in the shock of it. We know he had a battle with alcoholism after that for a couple of decades. But imagine being 24, 25 years old and being told that you're going to be president. So if we could go back, I also know from direct personal experience that the presidents were being told and have been told. Because I met this man, President Bill Clinton, William Jefferson Clinton, who was so young looking that he probably was still at Georgetown as an undergraduate. It was at a table at the La Hacienda. I was sitting here at about age 8. A college-aged Bill Clinton was here. Harold Agnew, the director of the Los Alamos Labs, was here. Ivan Browning, the director of science and technology for CIA, was here. And then my father was sitting here. and his colleague Joseph Conason from Parsons was sitting here. And they were just kind of smiling over at Bill Clinton, and he said, you know, fellas, I know that you work for the atomic research community, and I know that you do remarkable things like designing and building more effective nuclear weapons all the time and everything, but sometimes I get up in the morning and I look at myself in the mirror, and I have to pinch myself because I say, me, Bill Clinton, President of the United States someday? I'm telling you, fellas, that dog don't hunt. Okay, that was a little better. But anyway, Clinton knew. He knew, and he knew at a young age, that he was going to be president. I don't know when he was briefed. I mean, he was young, yes, but maybe he was already at Yale Law School. Maybe he was sent down to New York City from New Haven, or into the library of the Yale Law School, and maybe up to a meeting room, and maybe, who knows, maybe, you know, Barbara Walters and Vernon Walters and you know, Senator Mac Mathias and a couple of other dignitaries were there to kind of let him into the secret. But he clearly knew by the time that we had that lunch in Albuquerque. And he was very young. He was skinny. And then, of course, George H.W. Bush. Barack Obama also was told, because when he and I were serving in the Mars Jump Room program, we were being trained under Ed Dames in the summer of 1980 at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California. His presidency and mine were being openly discussed by who was present. His mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, who had been an intelligence operative in Kenya and Indonesia, even married into those cultures. His parents had worked for the OSS. His grandparents, rather, had worked for the OSS during World War II. And my father had ties to CIA. Brett Stilling's father was working at Lockheed Skunk Works. Ed Dames was basically a remote viewer for CIA. And at one point, Barry was in front of us and got up to talk to Major Dames. And Brett's father was sitting behind in the next row over here. Brett was here. My dad was sitting behind me. And Thomas J. Stillings of Lockheed leaned forward and said to his son Brett, who had been sitting behind Barry Soetoro, who is now using the name Barack Obama, he said, Brett, what does it feel like being in a Mars program like this with a future president? And before Brett could answer, my dad leaned forward from where he was sitting behind me and went, 2 future presidents, as he was looking at me with his eye twitching, which is what happened when my dad became consternated about something emotionally that was profound. Brett has testified that he believes my father was actually indicating I would be president. That wasn't a joke or something. Or was he just trying to buck me up because one of the other kids in the program was going to be president someday? There was also discussions held 20 years later between me and Courtney Hunt of the CIA, in which the first time I asked him whether I was going to be president, he said, yes, but I don't know how you get there. And that's a consistent answer because I've never held public office. So if I run in 2016 and win, I'm going to be the first president since George Washington without major party support or having held a political office, not a military one. I have also held a military office because as a result of my involvement in Pegasus, I was made a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy just to be able to track me in the Navy, intelligence files. I had my portrait taken as a Navy officer in fall of '81 at the Long Beach Navy Station. But here, 20 years later, I asked Hunt the first time, and he says, yes, but I just don't know how you get there. The second time I asked him, about a month later, he says, no, but you're on the scene. And I don't know if that means I'm a political figure who doesn't reach the White House, or he just wouldn't want to tell me that I would win, so they wouldn't screw up my winning by trying. And then the third time I asked him, he said, have you been briefed on 2015? And I said, no. And I'm going to go on the record with this, because this is what Hunt said. It may not happen, but I said, what happens in 2015? And he said, a political scandal so profound that a completely independent president and vice president come into office. And I said, are you free as a retired CIA official to tell me what that was? And he said, yes. He said, what happens is that there's a story on 60 Minutes revealing, I think it's Steve Croft, it may be one of the others, I believe this may be Steve Croft. For some reason, Steve Croft reporting this story is in my mind's eye. But what happens is there's a story on 60 Minutes in which it's revealed that over 300 members of Congress are CIA agents with Swiss bank accounts. So imagine the unleashing of public rage after all this privation that we've seen during the Depression, all of the wars that have been waged with our largesse, but without our approval, without even the Congress's approval. All the invasion of privacy with the eavesdropping that's occurred, that's been revealed like in the Snowden scandal. If the American people are told that more than half of Congress is controlled and owned by the CIA, literally put its operatives in Congress and paid them for doing so, bribed them off U.S. territory, basically, in where you could get away with it, like in Swiss bank accounts. So what Hunt described was a rage by the American people so profound that they demand complete independence running for the 2016 election, and that presidential and vice presidential tickets are assembled from people in the truth movement, like myself, like Governor Ventura, from academia, from the military, somebody like a Wesley Clark might be a candidate, but that those who are implicated in serving in government are basically invalidated because they're found to literally have been CIA agents. That's what Hunt described, and that is a rational route for me to the presidency. That could happen as a result of my work in the truth movement. I just don't know whether he was telling the truth or not or being accurate, but that's what one of my Mars training officers, who was career CIA, told me. So Barack Obama was not only aware of his presidency when we were being trained in 1980, when he was 19 years old. He just turned 19 in August of 80. But when we were rooming together briefly, a couple of days at the College of the Siskiyous, he was reading briefing documents that they were giving him to groom him for the presidency. One of them he showed me was a paper entitled "The Presidency in the U.S. Constitutional System," and I think it had been written by Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard. And of course, that's where Barry went to law school, was at Harvard Law School. So I'm running in 2016, and I might not win then, maybe I'll win later, but that's what Hunt described as a complete disaffection of the American people from their career politicians, who are so compromised as a result of being career intelligence assets, as some of us have suspected for a long time. Okay, so what was my investigation about? I was doing things like doing lists of combined facts. I had remembered, for example, that in a 1971 dinner at the La Hacienda restaurant in Old Town Albuquerque again, we had driven down in a car caravan from the Los Alamos National Labs. And one of my dad's colleagues came over to him as we were disembarking from our vehicle and said, Ray, the word on the street is the director is going to be joining us for dinner tonight. I just wanted you to notice that so you could prepare for it. And about 15 minutes after everybody was seated and had ordered their dinner, this man came into the La Hacienda restaurant and sat watching me, and his Harold Agnew has this characteristic pose of like leaning his head against his hand like this. And he sat right across from me, and I could see that my dad's colleagues from the Ralph M. Parsons Company were ignoring him, because who was he? He was the head honcho of their client, the Los Alamos National Labs, from the perspective of Parsons engineers. And I asked him what his name was, and he actually shook my hand and said, "Harold Agnew, pleased to meet you, Andy." Obviously he had seen my file and everything, right? How I was levitating small objects as a 3-year-old and so forth. How I was completing my dad's thoughts when he was working down in the basement when I was a 4-year-old. Okay, so he knew who I was. And I said, "Oh, Agnew, are you in relation to Spiro Agnew, who was then Vice President of the United States?" And Harold kind of looked thoughtfully up at the ceiling and said, "No, not that I know of." Or something like that. He said, "No, at least not that I know of," as if making a joke. He had actually run for state office, and he was a New Mexico state senator as a Democrat. So he was just, I think, being kind of cheeky with the guys on the project. So I then have his name, and then I had remembered that he was characteristically cheap because he refused to pick up his own lunch tab at the La Hacienda for a lunch, even though he was the director of the Los Alamos National Laboratory. He was making very good money in that era. And somebody had said to him, there was a circle of us around him trying to make him pay his bill for lunch, like for a ham sandwich, and a yellow bowl salad, right? And a Coke. And somebody said to him, "Harold, you're the cheapest member of the whole atomic research community." And I leaned in and said, "Yeah, you're the Jack Benny of the atomic research community." And they all laughed. Okay, so here I'm carousing with my dad's colleagues in New Mexico. He was, in fact, characteristically cheap. In fact, when I met a friend of his who was the husband of the woman who had handled the summer sublets when we were there on the project basis during the summers of 71, 73 accessed from fall of 71 and then 72, he said to me, well, you didn't, if you met Harold, you know how cheap he was. That was always the standard thing about Harold Agnew. It was kind of like a running joke that he was playing, I think, because he was saying that they all weren't being paid enough, and I think he was probably right. Okay, so I ran this string on Google, and I found him in Wikipedia. He was there was the guy that I had met. So that was one of the first proofs that I wasn't crazy. Another one is I described how when going into Gettysburg, I was walking on top of the wooden sidewalk. I stepped up onto the wooden sidewalk, and I was looking into the men's millinery shop, which was a clothing shop, accessories, hats, ties, tie pins, belts, shoes, canes, gloves, and so forth for sale there for men, and that there was a men's shoe shop next to it, and or kind of in the same, on a slightly lower and within the same ultimate store. And I had described how he was about 70. He had a sour expression on his face. When somebody asked what did he look like, I said, well, Robert F. Kennedy, if he had survived the shooting in 1968, may have, with his degree of sort of both humanity and defiance, might have looked like this man. But at 70, kind of looked like RFK Jr. And I said he was obviously limping up to the sidewalk like this, like with a recent probably bullet hole in his lower hip or upper leg. I described how he totally voluntarily helped me. I walked into town in the morning shivering because my shoes and socks had been wrenched off on the wormholing from East Hanover in 1972 to Gettysburg in 1863, so that by the time I walked into that shop district, my teeth, I was so cold that my teeth were actually chattering uncontrollably. I think that's the only time that's happened to me in life. And how, when he voluntarily helped me, he had a key to the millinery shop. He took out a skeleton key and went inside. He clearly had authority to take an old pair of shoes off the back shelf in the millinery shop and outfit my feet with them. So he had some authority there as a cobbler, as it were. It wasn't the new shoes on the right side of the building, it was, or the store. These were very, very weathered brown men's street shoes, and that he gave me the shoes out of the kindness of his heart. I then identified this man as John Lawrence Burns, and here's what I found. At the time that the battle was held, he was 69. At the time he helped me, he was 70, the exact age that I had spoken of. He looked exactly like the person I described, kind of a 70-year-old RFK. Right? If Bobby's features had widened out and his face had become sort of more resigned with the tragedies of the world, the weight of the world on his shoulder, I think he would have developed a more sort of formidable face like this. But he definitely looks like a Kennedy in terms of his overall sort of ethnic and familial kind of appearance. So I have described it as being sort of sour, and you can see in all of John Lawrence's pictures, he always kind of grimaced when his photograph was being taken. I said he'd been limping from a hip wound, apparently a recent wound, and I found that when he volunteered himself into the Battle of Gettysburg as a Union sharpshooter, just as he had volunteered himself into the War of 1812 as a teenager, as a sharpshooter, because he was gifted with a rifle, that he had been shot in the arm, twice in the arm and in the hip, and was surrendered off the battlefield under a Confederate flag of surrender. So you hear all these horror stories about war, but in fact the Civil War was fought in this kind of gentlemanly way, where they actually got this old man off the battlefield. He had actually approached a captain of the Irish Brigade, who told him, "I'm not going to let a 70." He said, "How are you, John?" I said, 70. I'm not going to or 69. I'm not going to let a 69-year-old be in my regiment. Why don't you go over to McPherson Farm? There's going to be a lot of action over there, and set up a position as a sharpshooter and just start killing the Rebs. And he did, but he still got shot there because the Confederates overran McPherson's farm, and he was shot, almost killed. I talked about how he had voluntarily helped me. Well, he volunteered into the War of 1812 and the Civil War, and fought battles at the risk of his life that he didn't have to even fight. And here he was 69. He didn't have to fight to protect the city. I found, for example, that Jubal Early, one of the Southern generals, had actually gone into Gettysburg before the battle and asked for $50,000 in cash, or all of the bullets and food in the entire town. And the president of the town council, who was John Lawrence Burns' employer, David Kendallhart, actually left town so as not to relent and comply with General Early's demand. So John Lawrence Burns was one of those people who stayed in the town of Gettysburg as the battle was occurring, and not only protected himself from the gunfire or the cannon fire, but fought it. He went out into the battle with his rifle and volunteered. So that's real volunteership, just like somebody who would help a kid. And I pointed out that he was helping a 10-and-a-half-year-old. When I went to Gettysburg recently and I did more research about John Lawrence Burns, I found that he and his wife, who was an invalid, she was in a wheelchair, nonetheless adopted for life as their daughter a young woman named Marcia Gibbons, who was the illegitimate daughter of the town ne'er-do-well, who never worked a day in her life and basically lived in the poorhouse. They called it the almshouse, and was basically the pariah of the entire town, because Gettysburg, in addition to being a crossroads town, then and now is an industrial town with not just farming, but light manufacturing. And so he and his wife, even though he was just a lowly cobbler, adopted the most controversial adoptee in their town at that time, which I think shows a real compassion towards helping children, like the 10-and-a-half-year-old stranger who wanders into town barefoot and shivering. He was the cobbler, not the shoemaker. I found a professional listing of his boss, David Kendallhart. David Kendallhart was memorialized as lawyer, shoemaker, and president of the town council. He was just the cobbler, or the fixer of old used shoes, and he had one of them that he put on my feet. And he met me while walking through the downtown area, the old downtown area in Gettysburg, in the morning, which I found he was known for having done back in Emmitsburg, where he formerly lived. He would go on like these walking jaunts, even at like 6 o'clock in the morning, all over town. And I found that he was the town constable. So if he wanted to disguise this young wayfaring stranger who had wandered into town shivering from Mr. Lincoln, he would have made sure that I got some clothes on and some shoes, and the people of Gettysburg had cared for one of their street urchins. And then he gave me shoes. Well, of course, he was a cobbler. I had described all these elements before I found out who he was and all of those attributes of this man. So that's beyond psychic. We can look at the next one. Here's a third proof that I did before digging deeper. I had remembered that I'd interacted with a man named Dr. Sterling Colgate when he was president of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology. My dad had described how he was a scion, basically an heir of the Colgate fortune, who had convinced Colgate to give millions of dollars to launch Project Pegasus, maybe billions, that he was working in a C-shaped building, which was an Aerojet Corporation facility in Socorro, New Mexico, a stone's throw from New Mexico Tech, and that the technology he used to send me to Gettysburg in 1863 from 1972 was called plasma confinement. I then, working from his name, found him online. Here's Stir at about 80 years of age. He's still alive. He's about 89. And as I said, I had gone to his house even to try to speak with him. Well, when I went to New Mexico on my second fact-finding trip in September of 2004 with my friend Dixie Karras from Vancouver, Washington, a friend and neighbor of mine, she parked our rental vehicle, literally parked it right on where that C-shaped building had been. We went inside, and we met a woman dying of cancer from playing in the uranium tailing pits in Los Alamos when she was a little girl. She was about my age. But she told us she had a rare form of cancer, and it was terminal. Her name was Joy Thompson. And she said, yes, there was a man named Sterling Colgate who worked here. He was the president of this institution. This is the research director for New Mexico Tech. So she's literally eating her lunch on a retaining wall between the existing New Mexico Tech buildings and where the C-shaped building of the Aerojet Corporation had been when I was a kid time traveling there. And she said, of course, I know who Sterling Colgate is. He was director of our physics department for like 25 years, and he was president for like 15 years, right around the time that you said you met him here. So she takes me into the research library, and she pulls the Sterling Colgate file. And I have the clip. I have it on DVD. I have it in storage now. But it's basically a mimeograph, photocopy of a newspaper clipping that says Dr. Sterling Colgate, president of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology, in Socorro, is giving a public lecture tonight on his advances in plasma confinement. Now, look, if this was a psychic incident, how could I have come up with such obscure and specific detail? I mean, I would aver that, if a psychic incident occurs, like the classic one to explain how psychic information passes between people faster than it can literally travel. In other words, Newton's inverse square law is that the intensity of a signal diminishes by reciprocal of the square of a distance, right? So that's why when a train goes by you on the platform, you have the Doppler effect where it's really low and then it speeds up and then it slows down again. Okay, that's because as you move unitary units away from the source of the information, you go from 1 to 2 to 9 and so forth. That would indicate that a psychic message that's going to get through faster than the speed of light is usually the kind of psychic messages that people report. A mother in Liverpool suddenly sees a flash of an event of her 18-year-old sailor son falling off of a ship off of Australia or whatever. They're always simple messages that are imparted with a psychic event. How could a psychic event cause me to identify this man, facially, to know his rare name, remember that he was called Stir as a nickname, that he was associated with New Mexico Tech, that he was descended from the Colgate family, etc. It goes beyond even psychic performance. I knew at that point that my memories were accurate. Okay, so what are the choices with primarily teleportation, chronovision? Okay, here's just a summary of where we're at. Time travel technology emerged in the U.S. defense technical community over 40 years ago. We've used some device, the jump room, to place U.S. personnel on Mars over 30 years ago. It might be a time travel device. It might just be a trans-chronological device of some kind. In other words, it's just a different way to get somewhere in real time. My position is that understanding and applying the best of what time travel technologies have to offer holds one of the major keys to resolving the crisis of environment and development in the 21st century. That is to say, we're going to be needing teleportation, we're going to have to implement it. It's also affecting the U.S. presidency in a way that was not contemplated by the framers, nor is understood by the American people. And it remains secret as a future eventuality that we should be thinking about, and as speculative, but not as a current reality, which is clearly 40 years behind the 8 ball. So, teleportation is either going to become a dominant form of public transport at the global, national, regional, and local level, or it's going to remain a secret weapon of war. If it remains a secret weapon of war, a valuable technology is being wasted because you can't teleport into water. There was an incident when I was teleporting with a group of children from different locations into an abandoned junior high school site in Santa Fe, not near the state not on the state capitol grounds. And one boy arrived from one of the other locations around the country, standing in a fountain where there were 3 inches of water. And as a result of that, his feet and the bottom part of his ankles arriving later, he literally lost his feet because he slid off of them. And when I ran around the fountain and saw him being pinned to the ground by one of the adult facilitators of the project, he was screaming, my feet, I'm only 9 years old. What am I going to do without any feet? Okay, so you can't teleport into water. Well, who would be teleporting into water if we continue to sequester teleportation as a secret weapon of war, as Rumsfeld had indicated in the spring 1971 lecture that I attended? Well, the Navy SEALs couldn't, because if they teleported, let's say, from a boat or a plane onto the shore, if they were even 3 inches into the water of a lake, the ocean, or whatever, they would slide off their ankles. They would lose their feet. We can't have Navy SEALs pursuing military objectives without feet. That's common sense. One of the girls, when I was on the project, we were told, looked up at the crystal array in the ceiling and went blind permanently. So clearly the chronovisors would also have to be carefully implemented. But if we continue to sequester teleportation as a weapon of war, we can't even use it to achieve what Rumsfeld had indicated of placing troops precisely where they were needed. Because what if they were needed right before a river? If some of them ended up being teleported into the river, they were going to be dismembered. They would be killed. They would be sawed in half, like, again, Fringe demonstrated when they stole my story about the boy losing his feet. Okay, so we can't do that. We have to implement it for public transport, and it has to be controlled, where you would arrive at a teleport, like at a major airport, and there wouldn't be any water around. You would keep the teleport dry, just like they keep objects off the runway that the commercial passenger jets use. So that's the choice. chronovision, it will either remain, or it will either evolve into some kind of publicly acceptable form of looking glass technology that where scenes are derived that don't violate personal privacy of people who once lived, are living, or who will live in the future, or it will evolve into looking at technology, and it maybe already has, namely the kind of technology used to surveil the American people in a 24-hour surveillance state. So quantum access really poses fundamental questions about whether we're going to have government by, or continue to have government by the consent of the governed, or government by the deceit of the governing. Because if they can zap their personnel around military bases, if they can get the President of the United States from Carswell Air Force Base in Fort Worth, Texas, to Pine Gap in Australia in seconds rather than hours, we're being deceived and we're having experiences of greater functioning in the universe held back from us. Also, with the chronovision, not the teleportation, but the chronovision being used to surveil us on a 24-hour basis, our civil liberties are being denied, like a right to privacy, by secret technology. To me, that's unacceptable. So my plan basically is to sustain my truth campaign about secret U.S. achievements of time travel and Mars visitation, continue to share my experiences in Project Pegasus and on Mars in mainstream and alternative media, and then as part of my recommendations of what I would bring about as president, a major one is what I would do with these two technical capabilities when I run for president in 2016. So thank you for attending, and thank you for your support. We've got about 15 minutes rather than an hour, but if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. I know it was a kind of technical presentation, but I'm using actually an evidential technique that lawyers use. It's called the inundative method of the development of argument. Put as many facts as possible at the feet of the jury. Yes, sir.
Have you have you created any like visual images or painted things or found creative expression for what a lot of these experiences would be like?
No, I'm going to have drawings of the devices in my book. And I might have kind of like N.C. Wyeth kind of illustrations of me doing things as a kid. I used to draw and paint, but I don't anymore.
I'm just particularly fascinated with things
Pardon
like what does the plasma field look like?
Yeah, it looked like basically a glass box or a lucite box with opalescent flashes in a cloud of white. And by the way, there's so many things I can't talk about in this time frame. I like to actually monologue for 10 or 12 hours about this stuff. The Montélimar time slip in France was caused by a field of radioactive plasma. The famous one with the two British couples, the Gibneys and the Simpsons, who went under the Channel and on their way to Nice to vacation in the south of France. And they stopped at this bed and breakfast in the town of Montélimar. And they noticed all these strange clues that didn't make any sense, like they didn't have glass on their hotel windows, they had wooden shutters. And the French bar mistress on the first floor of the facility didn't recognize the modern French word for motorway, because one of the British individuals was fluent in French. And then when they had breakfast, they were charged 4 pence for a French country breakfast at a bed and breakfast in Montélimar, which should have been like $200, right, US, or something high, $100 at least. And then as they were leaving, they saw two French gendarmes, two French policemen come into the tavern there where you could get breakfast, and they were wearing period clothing from like 100 years previously. Well, then when they finished their vacation and they stopped again at that town, they saw the same circus poster on the wall, but when they drove towards where the bed and breakfast was, it was just a vacant lot. And one of the locals was questioning. They said, "Oh yes, there was a tavern with a bed and you could sleep upstairs, like kind of like a hotel, like a bed and breakfast today." It was called like a country tavern or something in French at that time, where you could both eat and stay overnight. And they said, "Well, when was it there?" And they said, "Oh, like 1890." Okay, so that's as far as Jenny Randles took her investigation of the famous Montélimar time slip, because they then drove. Apparently, they had driven into it and then even out of it with their car. So these releases of radioactive plasma can really move a lot of tonnage of stuff through, non-locally in time space.
And may even be facilitated by something like a car.
Yes, in fact, I always think of like the phone booth in Bill and
Yeah.
Ted's Excellent Adventure.
Totally,
That's
totally.
a lot of metal to be sending through a vortal tunnel, right? To meet Socrates.
Right. I love it. That's
When
so
they went
great,
into
fellow.
Socrates. But the thing of it is, they were in their car when they drove into that time-space location because they just parked it and walked into the tavern, which hadn't been there for 100 years or more. So what I did is I furthered the investigation of that case, and I found that in the week before their famous Montelimar time slip, the Montelimar civilian nuclear power plant, which is the largest power plant in all of France, released the greatest amount of radioactive plasma that has ever been released in the history of the French nuclear power plant. And it blanketed the entire city. So what apparently happened is they drove their car through a wall of radioactive plasma as it was descending over the city, or it was just settled on the city because of, let's say, an inversion layer or something like that. And they literally drove into the past with their car. Now, I've interviewed people from around the country who have done things like made a U-turn on a major highway, and when they double back to go, let's say, go back to their residence because they left something at home that they were supposed to take or whatever, they drive up the opposite directed road, and they're in another city. Like one brother of a friend of mine in Hollywood, California, he did a UE because he had left her birthday present on his counter in his kitchen in Las Vegas. So like in Barstow, he did a UE and went back. He was going back to Vegas, but when he got up the up ramp up to the top of the overpass behind him, and he doubled back, he drove into a bridge in Biloxi, Mississippi. You know, so I wasn't going to Biloxi, I was going to Los Angeles, right, to Hollywood. He then panicked and went over the overpass and started going towards Los Angeles again, and he was back in Los Angeles. And he told her, when I went back to get your present, because I just accidentally left it at the house, when I did the UE, I didn't go up back to Barstow or back, to see signs back to Las Vegas. I was in Biloxi, Mississippi. So in addition to accidental releases of radioactive plasma from industrial processes like nuclear power plants, we also know that radioactive plasma rises up from the ground with the grinding of tectonic plates before an earthquake. We saw them, in fact, over Japan before the earthquake that caused the Fukushima type tsunami, and all the devastation from the tsunami itself and the radioactive pollution that the damage to the nuclear power plant there was caused. But so really, people we should really use these sightings of that pastel colored radioactive plasma. And by the way, the scenes like on Jeff Rentz's website of the opalescent light fields above Japan, like in the week before the Fukushima earthquake, they were identical to the opalescent quality of the fields of radioactive plasma that were being propagated to send us to the past, like when they sent me to Gettysburg.
Can you spell his last name?
Who's that?
Rents, Jeff.
Oh, Jeff Rentz? Yeah, Jeff Rentz is just the journalist Jeff Rentz. He's at rentz.com, which is RENSE.com.
Thanks.
I'm pretty sure that he published, either he or somebody like him published the images of these strange fields of light that were forming above the horizon in Japan before the Fukushima earthquake. And there was all this talk about, earthquakes being used as a weapon of war or anything. That's basically nonsense. When plates naturally shift, tectonic plates shift and grind against each other, they're already known to propagate fields of radioactive plasma. In fact, people should be told to not travel outdoors after the earthquake because it still may be lingering. And certainly the civilian nuclear plants that have to release radioactive plasma to prevent an explosion of their containment vessel, it's really incumbent on them to tell the public that the public should avoid being outdoors for a week or so after the exposure, because you may be time slipped. And people have asked me, do you think that people were time slipped to ancient Japan during Fukushima? And I said, probably yes. The question is whether they've come back yet. Usually the time slip caused by radioactive plasma is temporary, and the person finds themselves back in the present. So, these are some of the crossover issues. Do you advise the public not to go outdoors for, let's say, at least a day after an earthquake? Because an earthquake is a result of the grinding of the plates, which produces the dissemination of radioactive plasma. So, any other questions?
Yeah.
Sir?
You said that you couldn't bring metal when you're teleporting, right?
Right.
There's
Magnetic
a negative
metal.
effect, right?
Yes.
So if you had fillings in your teeth, would that be a
I
problem?
remember some aching and some discharging But then again, a lot of the metal that you carry in your person, like your zipper or tacks, what are they called? Snaps on your
Buttons.
clothing, buttons, but the kind that snap together. Snaps. Anything that is magnetic metal has almost always already been eliminated from clothing. So for example, you don't want lightning to be drawn to magnetic metal on the body, because it'll cause more damage than if it's demagnetized metal. So the issue is magnetic metal, including coinage. One time one of the little boys that was in the project with me kept a nickel, I think it was a nickel or a quarter, I think it was a nickel, in his pocket, and it actually started vibrating and heating up, and it shot out of his pants, and it actually burned and slit his pants all the way down as it hit the ground. And I heard it when we reappeared on the tarmac at Curtis Wright. It kind of went, ping! Now that could have killed either one of us if it had ricocheted into our heart or something, or into our brain. So coinage was out. People have asked me about glasses. I didn't have glasses, and they ended up being plastic glasses at 17, so I was fully sighted at age 7 through 11 when I was teleporting on Pegasus.
So the fillings are not magnetic, and that's why you didn't have that effect?
I don't know. I haven't researched that enough. I'm just simply distinguishing the point that they made sure that we were always being admonished to not have any magnetic metal on us. So like you'll be at a stationery shop, and you'll see how paper clips will cling to a magnet. Sometimes they use a magnet to throw all the paper clips. My dad was always conscientious. He was always like in the moment, knowing what he was doing, and he cognizant of what the trade-offs were. And he intentionally left that paperclip back at the jump room facility, not the jump room, but the teleport at Curtis Wright before doing that first trip with me to talk to Dr. Agnew. So he actually handed Dr. Agnew an unattached sheaf of paper. So he had kind of rolled it up in his hand because he had taken the paperclip off of that prospectus that he had drafted. So yeah.
Andy, how were you able to take the metal tube back to Gettysburg?
The metal tube to Gettysburg?
Yeah.
No, it wasn't. It was a piece of paper. It was,
I thought it was a tube.
No, it was just an 8.5 by 11 sheaf of paper that I had just scrolled up because I was
Okay.
holding it in my hand. It was actually, I had perspired on it a lot. It was actually kind of wilted by the time I got back to
And
the
also
present.
the 16 millimeter footage of the chronovisor, is that in color?
No, the images I saw of the crucifixion of Jesus, or that was said to be Jesus of Nazareth, were black and white, and they were fading out of view, and there was a lot of striation running through the picture. So suddenly it would be a clear shot of Jesus on the cross and his arms, and it would be utterly clear. At other times, it would be like a mid shot, and you'd see, let's say, down to his waist on the cross. And there'd be so much striation running through it that it almost looked like he was being crucified in a deluge, just a huge rainstorm. But it was actually the fact that they had propagated a colored hologram of the event and then filmed it. So it had moments of sort of insubstantiality resulting from 16 millimeter film footage of a hologram, a moving hologram at that. So sometimes it was clear and it almost looked like, Cecil B. DeMille or somebody had staged a crucifixion scene. And at other times, it was so utterly realistic in terms of how we could see that it was really a man dying by being crucified, that we had no doubt that it was a real event.
And that's same for the declaration footage?
Actually, what's weird about that, and this was true of some of the chronovised images, it was clear, and it was like sepia toned. It was neither color nor black and white. It was like gray with some brown and green tones evident. Yeah, but it wasn't clear enough for me to make out Washington. I mean, he looked thinner and shorter than he had been depicted in all the heroic pictures I had seen of him when I was growing up. And when I met Washington via chronovision, he was a striking figure, but he wasn't the big guy that was depicted in the paintings and so forth. Washington had kind of a bemused swagger. Sort of like, well, tell me, are you boys angels? Oh, you're time travelers from our own future. Alec, listen to this. These lads say that they're time travelers from our own future. He's kind of like a debonair kind of English gentleman. More like about the size of and thinness of like a tall golfer with kind of skinny legs. and the voice and the British accent of Prince Charles. He really had the King's English.
Yeah.
King, I guess that was what, King George III at that point, the Hanoverian, third Hanoverian one. Yeah, but he was very charismatic. He was very confident, highly intelligent, had a very commanding sort of devil-may-care kind of personality. See, he had grown up during the Cavalier age, so he had actually learned from his elders. He wasn't acting like a revolutionary, he was acting like a cavalier. Sort of like, so tell me, you say that you're time travelers from our own future? How does that work? He doesn't have, he had this, I came up with the term bemused swagger. You know, he's not like he was depicted. He was sort of an urbane English gentleman. But he was nonetheless very striking as a person, and in his blue and gray uniform, he was basically a radiant person.
Was he wearing a wig, or was he just regular
Yes,
clothes?
he was wearing a white wig, and I don't think he was wearing, you know, rouge or pancake makeup like people have alleged. That might have been present when they had public meetings. But being in the encampment there above New York Harbor, he did have a wig on. He was the commanding officer there. And he did have a striking blue and gold suit. And, you know, almost yellow golden pants, but pretty much gold. But he had a wig, but he was still, you know, he came off as a very masculine guy, even notwithstanding the fact that he was a guy wearing a wig.
Yeah.
But he was also just very urbane. But of course, he was one of the leading citizens of the whole colonies. He married Martha Dandridge Park Custis, who was the richest widow and the largest landowner in all of Virginia. When he married, he got 4,000 acres of prime Virginia farmland and 200 slaves, every one of which he manumitted. Now, Washington was sterile as a result of venereal infection when he was sleeping with prostitutes in the Cumberland Gap in Ohio during previous times as a young man. So the father of our country didn't have any children. But many of his slaves were named Washington because they were from the Washington plantation. So a lot of the African Americans with the name Washington are actually descendants of George Washington's freed slaves. Unlike Jefferson, he freed every one of his slaves.
Mm-hmm.
That's another reason why I think Washington was really the indispensable person of that time period, not Benjamin Franklin. Having met him, I can say that he was a remarkable human being by any standard in any culture. Now, when I was in Philadelphia in April, I had flashed backwards to a life where I was Dr. Thomas Bond, who was the physician for the Revolutionary Army. And that was somebody who would have clearly consulted with Washington during the war. So I'm now speculating, did they send me back among all 10-year-old Americans? By then I was all, no, when I went to see Washington, couldn't have been more than 9, maybe even still 8, but it was fall of 70. And so I just think it's interesting that I stayed at Dr. Thomas Bond's house, and I retrieved memories of actually decorating his drawing room on the left side of the house. It's a bed and breakfast in Philadelphia if you ever want to stay at an interesting place when you're in the historical district there. And I remembered being Thomas Bond, I remembered my medical career, how I had studied in France and England, and then was the